There is a route on K2 that was considered to be the most difficult climb on the Savage Mountain for over 25 years, and some of the most accomplished climbers from the 1980s and 90s referred to it as the most difficult route in all the Himalaya and Karakoram. The path pops up constantly throughout the history of K2 in some of the deadliest years of the mountain. In 2004, one man was successful in completing the climb, becoming only the second expedition to accomplish the feat. But it came at a steep price and ends in tragedy. This is K2's Magic Line. This is the story of Jordi Corominas. Although K2 is 781 feet shorter than the world's tallest peak, Everest, the 28,251-foot mountain is considered one of the most dangerous peaks in the world. Unlike Everest, almost every route on K2 averages 45 degrees from base to summit, meaning one slip, one rock fall, or even just some heavy snow, and climbers can tumble hundreds, if not thousands of feet down the slope with no ability to stop their fall. Additionally, the location of the mountain makes it particularly difficult to reach. There are no fancy tents or luxuries on the Savage Mountain, and the most difficult path to climb, one of the most difficult mountains in the world, is called the Magic Line. The first attempt of the Magic Line began in the summer of 1979. An Italian, German, Austrian team attempted to climb the route, but within weeks they realized it just was too difficult. They would eventually climb K2 the traditional route, becoming the fourth expedition to ever summit the peak. Later that summer, a French expedition made up of 15 climbers would attempt to climb the same path. It would take them over 21 days to establish a camp at 7,500 meters, and then an entire month to reach 8,000 meters before the expedition was called off. In 1986, 2 Americans would die on the Magic Line after a boulder would become loose and sweep them off the slope. A solo expedition led by Renato Casarato would also take place on the route that year. I have an entire video detailing his expedition, so feel free to check that out after this one. Spoiler alert, it did not end well for Casarato. 1986 would also be one of the deadliest years in the mountain's history. The first successful ascent would take place that same summer in 1986, when a 3-man Polish-Slovakian team would finally complete the Magic Line, but during their descent, one of their team members would fall to his death in the dark. In 2004, Jordi Corominas, Manel de la Mata, Oscar Cariac, Jordi Corominas, and Valentin Gira attempted to climb the Magic Line for the first time since 1986. Their attempt would be nicknamed the Tarragona Magic Line Expedition 2004. Like most expeditions, the climbers would fly into a nearby town called Skardu, then trek their way through the Karakoram over 10 days with the help of nearly 50 porters, carrying over 1,500 kilograms of supplies needed for the climb. After reaching the base of K2, they would establish base camp at 5,000 meters. This would be their home for the foreseeable future. The expedition was expected to last 2 months, consisting of climbing the Magic Line, establishing camps further up on the mountain, and leaving supplies along the route, then eventually descending back to base camp to rest before repeating the process, each time reaching a higher point. The first obstacle on the Magic Line is the Filippo ice field. Think of it as a smaller version of the Khumbu icefall on Everest. There are hundreds of crevasses and seracs surrounding the climbers, and of course, there is always a risk of avalanches. After reaching Pico Negrado at the top of the ice field, they would then climb a steep slope and establish Camp 1 at 6,400 meters. It took the original expedition over a month to reach this point, and after 5 attempts, the 2004 expedition would reach that same camp. This is when the expedition really began. From this point on, Jordi, Manel, and Oscar would be trailblazing. This means they would be on the mountain, establishing the route, while other members of the expedition would be at base camp, ensuring there were enough supplies and taking care of the daily chores. So after reaching Camp 1, Manel would be climbing above the other 2 men. It was a perfect day. The sky was clear, and the weather was on the warmer side, at least for K2. and they would need to take advantage of it because the climb from Camp 1 to Camp 2 is one of the most difficult areas, as it is nearly vertical rock scaling for most of the 500 meters that separate them. It was during this climb that while Manel was hanging on a steep pitch covered with rock and ice, he began to feel the dreaded mountain shake. It was an avalanche. He would quickly secure himself, grip onto his harness as tight as he could, and hug the wall as large chunks of snow rained down on him. It felt like an eternity, but eventually the snow would stop, and Manel was still hanging onto the wall. He would radio down to Jordi and Oscar. Both had survived the avalanche, but it would frighten the trio and serve as a reminder of what the peak can do. At the end of July, there would be 2 days of clear weather, and the trio would make it all the way to Camp 3 at 7,500 meters. From Camp 3 to the summit, there is 1,100 meters of vertical climbing, but the real challenge is the altitude. While above 8,000 meters, the oxygen is a fourth of what it is at sea level, which makes the technical climbing 8 times harder than at lower levels on the mountain. There is no easy section of the climb, and that is what makes the magic line so difficult. On August 16th, Oscar, Manel, and Jordi would reach their last camp at 8,100 meters, where they would rest for a few hours before beginning the final summit bid at 4 a.m. For 6 hours, they would climb the vertical wall in the death zone. But at 10 a.m. at 8,300 meters, Oscar would decide to turn around, and minutes later, Manel would join him. After a short rest in the tent at 8,100 meters, they would both descend back to Camp 3, where they would spend the night. Meanwhile, Jordi would continue to climb the magic line. I cannot express the challenges and difficulty of the final 500 meters. Jordi was climbing a vertical rock wall covered in ice and snow above 8,000 meters alone. He was never truly sure if he was climbing the correct route because they had never made it this far, but he had no choice but to continue. After 24 hours of climbing, Jordi would reach the summit of K2 in the dark, becoming only the second expedition to accomplish the feat. After reaching the summit, Jordi would begin the descent almost immediately, but this time he would be climbing down the Abruzzi Spur. The only issue was he was descending in the dark on a route that he had not climbed. And for those of you familiar with the Abruzzi Spur, the biggest danger is the bottleneck, a tight couloir that has a giant serac constantly hovering over climbers. Jordi would eventually make it through the bottleneck and come across a Japanese expedition that would guide him down to Camp 3, where after 30 hours of continuous effort, he would finally get to rest. The next morning, Manel and Oscar kept descending. Despite the increasing bad weather and their exhaustion, they were both happy and content. On their way down, they talked about future projects and new climbs to attempt in the next months. They slept in Camp 2 at 6,900 meters, and the next morning, on Wednesday, they climbed back to Camp 1. It was then when Manel, for the first time, began to complain of acute abdominal pain that was preventing him from breathing normally. His health would quickly decline over the next few hours, but Oscar would stay by his side, helping him eat, hydrate, and stay warm. Communication with base camp would eventually break, as the severe cold had exhausted the batteries in the climber's radio. But Wednesday evening at 8 p.m., Oscar was able to send a short message that said "Help Negrado," referring to their current location. While rescue efforts would begin immediately, there was a severe snowstorm taking place, so nobody would be able to reach Camp 1 until the following day on August 19th. But it was too late. That morning at 4:30 a.m., Manel had passed away in Oscar's arms, concluding the 2004 expedition with success and tragedy. Manel would be buried at the memorial grave on K2, 500 meters from base camp. This is where the remains of many who have fallen on the mountain lay. After the expedition, Jordi Corominas would state, "Had the summit been our main objective, we would have climbed the Abruzzi Spur, but we were interested in the process, the method, and the style of ascent. While the expedition would end in tragedy, the accomplishment cannot be understated. The most difficult route on the most difficult mountain in the world has never been repeated since 2004, and it is unlikely that anyone will attempt the climb anytime soon."